ransomware was recently discovered dubbed PowerWare, which targets organizations via Microsoft Word and PowerShell. And just last week, Carbon Black released a report looking at how PowerShell is being utilized for malicious intent. They wrote in the report that the discovery of using PowerShell in attacks such as PowerWare is part of a larger, worrisome trend when it comes to PowerShell. On today's Cyber Chat, we talk with Carbon Black senior security researcher Rico Valdez about the company's recent findings and how cybercriminals are increasingly using PowerShell to remain under the radar while targeting organizations. To get started, Carbon Black recently put out a report on how actors are using PowerShell to perform cyber attacks. Normally, we don't really get too far into the technical details of these individual techniques or malware on this podcast, but I thought this might be a good chance to kind of get into sort of how these attacks work and how actors are compromising these organizations. But I guess first, what is PowerShell? If you could give us a little brief highlight of that.
Sure. PowerShell itself is basically a system administration tool that has been part of the Windows systems for quite a while now. I think the report stated 2009. PowerShell gives administrators a utility to do various administration tasks. It's quite powerful in that it can pretty much touch any part of the system. And, if you're running it with the right privileges, it can pretty much do anything on the system. It's also a scripting language. So you can write scripts to do things, and you can have PowerShell execute those scripts. And again, those scripts can do virtually anything on the system, changing, host names, setting network parameters, proxy settings, just about anything. So as a result, attackers have started to realize that is on the system and that's available for them to use. And so more and more attacks are now leveraging that tool instead of potentially downloading other tools or other malware that attackers would need to get their job done.
Yeah, and it's my understanding then that PowerShell is just kind of a tool that these attackers are using in order to further their attacks. So just wondering if you could explain the process of how a typical attack works. I mean, obviously the specifics change, but I mean, just in general, what are the steps that these attackers are going through when, let's say, they're compromising an organization? And then how does PowerShell fit into that?
Sure. Well, at a high level, attackers will try to find a way to get some code running on the target system. Could be through an exploit of a vulnerable application that's exposed, or a phishing email, or malicious Word document, something of that nature. Once they get that ability, oftentimes attackers would download additional tools, backdoors, things like that. That still can be a component of many attacks, but many times now they will call PowerShell or use PowerShell scripts to further their attack. Again, there's a lot of things that PowerShell can do, registry manipulations, things like that. You could set scheduled tasks, have a system kind of reach out and hit an external system that could be attackers at a specific time. So there's lots of things there. One of the most interesting things about PowerShell is that it's not very well understood by defenders, and so it used to be the kind of thing where only really sophisticated adversaries would use it, but it's gotten to the point now where it's being incorporated in a lot of commodity malware. And so because it's a trusted application in most cases, people don't necessarily think to go and dig in to see what PowerShell may have done. In addition, if you can get PowerShell to do the bad stuff, you don't necessarily have to download, again, additional malware or things like that antivirus might trip on. So it's another way to kind of stay under the radar and try to remain undetected.
Yeah, I guess the first time that PowerShell really came into my consciousness this year was, believe it was the PowerWare ransomware that I think was announced last month. I think you guys wrote a little bit about it in a blog post. It might have been authored by you. Someone said that it's a novel approach to ransomware and that it's deceptively simple in code. So just wondering what makes that unique and why is it trending more now? And if so, why is it trending more now than in the past?
Well, I think it's trending more now, primarily again because the techniques are just becoming better understood, and there's more reports on them, and attackers are realizing this is a really good way to kind of get things done, and again try to stay stealthy and under the radar. The PowerWare thing was interesting to us because we hadn't run across, ransomware has been in the news for a long time, and it continues to be in the news, and it's hitting more and more targets. And this was an implementation of ransomware. Again, traditionally, the attack pattern would be somebody opens a malicious Word document or something of that nature, hits the wrong website with a vulnerable browser. And at that point, more code would be downloaded, the ransomware malware specifically, and then that would execute and start, encrypting files on the file system. Well, in this case, PowerWare specifically, what was downloaded was just a text file, a PowerShell script. And so text files are much more innocuous. People don't usually perceive a risk from text files. And again, now with PowerShell, you can feed that text file, that script file to PowerShell. And yes, it's a very simple thing, very straightforward to script that up. And the blog does kind of go into it in some detail. And basically, instead of pulling down another binary, the malicious word macro in the PowerWare case would launch cmd.exe, the command shell, and then from there launch PowerShell. And PowerShell itself would reach out and pull down this text file and execute it. And again, that text file being a script instructed PowerShell to basically encrypt all the files and then display a little HTML file that was embedded in the script, telling people how they can get their files back if they pay the ransom.
You mentioned malicious macros, and I wanted to get your thought on that because it seems like every single person I interview brings up malicious macros and all these reports. Everyone talks about how seems like that's always the attack vector that people are getting infected with. I don't know if you have anything or any thoughts that stand out about that.
It's a bit depressing and it's frustrating because clearly we've been dealing with macros for years and years and years now, and they still seem to bite people. Some organizations use macros quite extensively in their Word docs, especially Excel spreadsheets, things of that nature. And when people are aware of their functionality and they are aware that they need to use them in some cases, that's step one. And then step two is, perhaps a well-crafted phishing email. So somebody believes it's a legitimate file, and if they are used to turning on macros when they get something from that person, that can do it. A lot of it comes down to user education too, nothing new there. But again, it is disheartening to see macros still being such a threat. And it does seem like they've been in the news a little bit more recently as well. So they seem to be making a bit of a resurgence.
Then getting back to PowerShell, you guys also put out a report, your United Threat Research Report, just talking a little bit about some of the different incident responses and stuff having to do with PowerShell. Just wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that report and what you guys found and how prevalent it was.
Sure. I wasn't involved in the report directly, so I'm kind of going off of what I've talked to other people about as well. But yeah, the main thrust of the report is that, we're trying to raise the awareness of PowerShell being used and the threat that it presents. Most places can't disable PowerShell or make use of PowerShell. So it really comes down to kind of watching it, monitoring it, and making sure that it's being used legitimately. The report highlights the fact that more and more malware is using it. I believe in this survey that was done with our various IR partners, they identified that 87% of attacks leveraging PowerShell were commodity malware attacks, which basically just demonstrates that it's kind of moved from a technique used by targeted attackers and is now being more generally used. And that's the main thrust of it. I think what we're trying to really push with this report is to let people know, hey, this is a real risk in your environment. You need to be aware of it, because again, most people aren't watching it, monitoring it, or anything like that. Even during incident response investigations, I wouldn't be surprised if there are more instances of PowerShell being leveraged than are seen here. primarily because it's often difficult to identify attacks that use PowerShell unless you're really monitoring it well.
Yeah, I wonder if you have a sense of like if organizations or if certain organizations are monitoring or are doing a good job on this front. Like, for example, do you think the large enterprises are know about this threat and are monitoring it, or do you think it's something that even at the large level there's some lack there?
I think most of the larger enterprises, those with what I would refer to as well-staffed and more sophisticated security operations centers, SOCs, those guys at least know about the risks. Again, monitoring it can be very tricky. The report outlines a few ways to enable logging and to try to identify those things a little bit better. Our products, actually, we have two products, a response product and a protection product. They can both be configured to identify these attacks, and our protection product can put some controls around PowerShell so that you can limit who can run it and what it can do and things of that nature. But back to your point, yeah, I don't think it's very well understood, even by the larger SOCs. It's kind of one of those things that's a little bit further down on the list for a lot of these organizations to really dig into, and most SOCs are really just kind of overworked. Some of the more sophisticated ones that have the staffing and the resources, I do believe are turning their heads to this and trying to get a handle on it.
Yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts in general on just the way cybercriminals are trying to evade detection, because I've seen a lot of articles and I've talked to a few people just talking about the new techniques with different malware, ransomware, how it's making it more difficult for researchers to basically research and look into that, as well as harder for businesses to defend against. So just wondering, is that something that you guys are seeing as well?
The bad guys are going to do their best to remain undetected until they reach their goals, right? Ransomware in general is they're not really trying to avoid detection for very long, just long enough to get the files encrypted, and then they announce themselves, right? So the detection aspects on ransomware are a little bit different, but more generally speaking, again, the big things with PowerShell are a few things. One is that people aren't really looking at it much. They don't really consider it a threat. It's another tool that they're used to using and that they find valuable. Another thing is that, again, with PowerShell, you don't need to download extra binaries. And that really is hard for things like antivirus and other technologies to protect against. And so that's another reason that attackers are turning towards the PowerShell techniques, is because they're more likely to succeed. PowerShell is very well understood. It's on just about every Windows box in the enterprise out there. And again, the monitoring around it, understanding what it did after the fact, can be very difficult. So, that's the main thrust, I think, for attackers moving this direction. Higher probability of success of their encryption or their goals. The higher probability of success with their attempt.
Yeah, and then my final question, I'm always curious just to get everyone's kind of high-level trend of where they think cybercrime or cybersecurity is going. I mean, obviously, we talked a little bit about ransomware, and that's one of the big things everyone keeps bringing up. Just wondering if anything at all sticks out to you, either with the bad guys or the good guys, in terms of kind of what's going on and what's trending in the industry.
Yeah, well, I think PowerShell is a good example of kind of what happens in this industry, right? Techniques are discovered by the really sophisticated adversaries, the nation state types, and once they start using those techniques, little by little, the word gets out. PowerShell was an example of that. It wasn't really used a whole lot. There's a lot of stuff going on around WMI as well right now. WMI being Windows Management Instrumentation, another Windows component. PowerShell interacts with that nicely, and again can be used to create backdoors and other things. So there's an overall trend of, again, in the context of avoiding detection and staying stealthy, trying to avoid dropping a lot of tools on a system, right? Because every time you drop a tool, antivirus is probably going to try to take a look at it, potentially block it. But when you can utilize the tools that are already on the system, it leaves much less of a footprint. A lot of people refer to that kind of thing as living off the land. Basically just using what you've got there. And again, the primary reason is to stay under the radar and to avoid detection and prevention of your goals.
Yeah, that's all the questions I have, unless there's anything you wanted to touch on that I missed.
Not really. I would mention, I don't want to put a plug in for our products necessarily, but I do want to highlight the fact that our products do a very good job of detecting this stuff. For example, our response product captures command lines that are fed to PowerShell, which can really be useful in identifying PowerShell abuse. So yeah, lots of stuff that can be done around detection and prevention, but you really do need specialized tools. Most of the things that are that have been leveraged up until now just don't really give you that full visibility, and it's difficult then to detect these kinds of things. People can use PowerShell, attackers can use PowerShell in an environment and hop around, jump from system to system, things like that for a long time and remain unnoticed.
And that'll do it for this week's Cyber Chat podcast. The Cyber Chat podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs helps organizations and service providers quickly establish a strategic cyber threat intelligence operation that drives more effective use of their tactical defenses. For a weekly recap of important cybercrime news, check out Surfwatch Labs' other podcast, the Surfwatch Cyber Risk Roundup. And for more information on cyber risk intelligence, check out surfwatchlabs.com.